This week, two books that look closely at the media. First up, what does the relationship between President Trump and Fox News mean for the media and its coverage of politics? Brian Stelter will be here to talk about his new book, Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. And then, how did Netflix take over our viewing lives? Reed Hastings, the co-founder and CEO, will be here to talk about his new book, No Rules Rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention. Alexander Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's September 11th. I'm Pamela Paul. Brian Stelter joins us now. He is the anchor of CNN's Reliable Sources, the host of its podcast, and the author of a new New York Times bestselling book, Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
So you used to be my colleague here at the New York Times way back. I don't know, when exactly did you leave the Times?
In 2013.
2013.
CNN called.
Well, so the moment I remember was in 2011 when this early documentary about the Times came out called Page One.
Yes.
And there was a line in that documentary in which the late David Carr says, "I still can't get over the feeling that Brian Stelter was a robot assembled to destroy me." I have to bring up that line because I wonder if you're secretly three people. You host a show on CNN, you write a daily newsletter, you host a weekly podcast, you have two small children, and somehow you wrote a book on this extremely fast-moving subject that is Donald Trump. How did you handle all of that?
The two small children is the fun part. They keep me sane. You know, David used to say, and I still miss him so much, he used to say, "What do you think the story is that I should tell?" He used to say to sources, you know, if you were writing the story, what would you write? And that is what I was doing with folks at Fox News. And these themes kept coming up, especially last year, which compelled me to go and try to get a book deal. I think it was less that I wanted to do this and more that I felt like someone had to. I hope that doesn't sound too cocky, but it's true. There are some things in life you just feel like you got to go tell this story. And I think the only untold story of the Trump years that's left, maybe, is the story of his Fox News addiction. So I did carve out time in between my other jobs. And frankly, once the pandemic sent us all home and put us on to lockdown, I'm just grateful that my wife was able to help with the kids when I was having to finish the final chapters of this book.
So what is that story, the relationship between Donald Trump and Fox News? Obviously, it's the full subject of your book, but I think most people who are even casual viewers or news consumers are aware that there's a close relationship there.
Yes, I think we all are aware that the president gets fed information and misinformation from Fox, but I think it's even more extreme and even more dangerous than people realize. It happens more often, and the connections are even cozier than folks realize. I oftentimes notice in coverage of the White House, reporters leave out what I think is the key piece, the key ingredient, which is he got that idea from Fox. He gained that idea from Fox. He gained that conspiracy theory from Fox. And with this pandemic this year, staffers at Fox told me they felt like the coverage was hazardous to our viewers. The coverage was dangerous. The coverage was unforgivable. You know, I really just tried to step away, just be the messenger for these anonymous sources, well, mostly anonymous. Some did speak on the record, who felt like the coverage is hurting the country.
All right. So a defender of Fox News, a skeptic here might say, so what if Trump follows Fox News's leads? You know, Democratic presidents in the past have taken their cues from the editorials of the New York Times. What's the difference?
I think it's so much more intense now. Fox's influence is constant. When Trump threatened North Korea and said he had a bigger button than Kim Jong-un, it was because of a Fox segment. When he grants pardons, it's because of Fox. When he attacks big technology companies, it's because of Fox. When he raged about migrant caravans, it was because of Fox. And it's not that he's getting the best possible information distilled from the best sources in the world. No, he's getting it from a bunch of staffers who oftentimes misinform him. I think that's one of the differences between this White House and past White Houses. You know, Barack Obama he watched ESPN in the evening rather than MSNBC. George W. Bush might have watched some Fox, but he wasn't consumed by it the way that this president is. So it's an unprecedented relationship. It really is.
So who's pulling the strings behind the scenes at Fox News? Because for a while, people just equated Fox News with Roger Ailes. Now, obviously, he is gone and now dead. And then, the other big name was, of course, Bill O'Reilly, also now gone effectively, certainly from Fox News and from much of the media. So are there certain players there? Is there one person who's kind of taking the lead?
Well, I think Sean Hannity has become the most powerful person at Fox in the Trump age. And not coincidentally, he is one of the Trumpiest. He has the closest relationship to Trump of anybody on the air at Fox. Sometimes when people say to Hannity, who's in charge at Fox? He says, I am. And he may mean that partly as a joke, but there's a lot of truth to it. These stars have their own fiefdoms. They control their own time slots. They control whatever they want to say in those time slots. And obviously, television hosts want and expect autonomy, and that's understandable. But when there's not a layer of oversight or accountability for screw-ups and conspiracy theories and lies and propaganda, then you get into a situation where the place feels leaderless, like it doesn't have a vision or a leader. I will say, though, I mean that on the editorial side. On the business side, this is an incredibly profitable business. As Michael Grimbaum and others have written for the New York Times recently, this is a business that is astonishingly profitable. So there obviously are managers running the business. I just don't think there are enough eyes on the content, trying to make sure that the audience is not misinformed and radicalized by the hosts.
All right, I want to get to the business side in a minute, but just sticking with the editorial, is that sense of there being kind of no leader who's orchestrating all of this, is that different post Ailes? Has it become more dangerous, more unfettered since Roger Ailes left Fox News?
Yeah, this was definitely the result of Ailes being forced out. Of course, once the Murdochs finally had to grapple with the abuse that Ailes was engaging in, what he was doing behind the scenes at Fox, and they forced him out, it left a leadership vacuum. And that leadership vacuum is something that was Roger's fault. He didn't groom a successor. But I quote a former Fox correspondent, Connor Powell, in the book saying, in the weeks and months after Roger was fired, Fox was rudderless. No one was in charge. And that's the way people describe it now, even 3+ years later. I have producers and others who say the place is on cruise control. Now, that might be effective for viewers. Viewers are certainly happy with the content. It's become Trumpier and Trumpier. But from a leadership perspective, if you view this as a leadership book, this is the opposite of Reed Hastings' new book. This is about what not to do, how not to run an empire.
I think a lot of people, again, outside the media would just assume, well, of course, the Murdochs are in control, meaning Rupert Murdoch. But Rupert Murdoch was pretty open about his opposition to Trump as a candidate early on. Did he change allegiances? Was this a calculated business move? What happened?
It was absolutely calculated, as a family friend said to me. There was something in it for both of them. At the end of the day, business trumps ideology, business trumps principle. This became a mutually beneficial relationship for Rupert Murdoch and President Trump. I described Rupert's business interests throughout Hoax and how he benefited from this friendship with the president. But it is astonishing to go back 5 years and read the quotes from 2015 where Rupert was trashing Trump and saying that Trump was embarrassing his friends and the country. It's not as if Rupert is the biggest Trump fan out there now. He certainly criticizes Trump behind his back, says Trump is crazy, he's an idiot. Words like that are quoted in Hoax. But he has found this, alliance of sorts that benefits him and his company.
And not to get to succession here, but what about his children? Is his son Lachlan a true believer?
I think Lachlan has always been more conservative than he has sometimes been portrayed. There's sometimes been this impression in the press that Rupert has these liberal sons, James and Lachlan. James is absolutely liberal. He supported Pete Buttigieg in the primaries. He has left the family empire and he's off making his own plans. But Lachlan is now running Fox Corporation, and he does have more of a conservative bent. He's friendly with Tucker Carlson, for example. And he seems quite content with what's airing on Fox News, even when the content is trying to justify violence or promote conspiracy theories or alleged crazy voter fraud. He's okay with that. He mostly is focused on the business. But there is a cliffhanger in Hoax involving James, involving the other son of Rupert Murdoch, and whether James could try to mount a takeover someday in the event of Rupert's death.
I guess stay tuned for season 2 on that one. Does Fox News, from a business standpoint and an audience standpoint, need to worry about its own right flank? I mean, for a long time, they were the most right-wing or the most populist of media organizations, but now you have One America News, you have Breitbart. Are they struggling on the other side of the political spectrum to maintain their loyal audience?
There is an aspect of that that's very true, but I don't think that the rival channels like Newsmax and One American News have a big enough audience, big enough reach right now to be a threat to Fox. People at Fox News kind of laugh and scoff at One American News and make fun of that, crazy conspiracy theory channel, and it is kind of true that when you hold them up next to each other, OAN makes Fox look moderate. Looks like ABC or NBC next to the far right nature of One American News. But here's where the threat to the business is. It's that Fox loyalists, the true Trump base, they don't want to see news on Fox. They turn off the news on Fox. They only want to see pro-Trump talk shows. So to the extent that Fox is trying to present itself as a channel with lots of fair news coverage, that can be a turnoff to these viewers who don't want that anymore, if they ever did.
Let's move over to the business side for a few minutes. You mentioned earlier, we talked about Roger Ailes and, of course, Bill O'Reilly. It seemed that what finally got them out the door, particularly O'Reilly, with the exposure of all of the Me Too stories involving O'Reilly, that what ultimately got him out of the door was the fact that advertisers were pulling out, that it became a business side situation and that it wasn't profitable for them. It was too dangerous for them to hold on to him. In a similar way, there have been advertisers, particularly in the last 6 months, that have pulled out from certain shows on Fox. There have been campaigns because of things said on Tucker Carlson's show, for example. Is this a real threat?
The advertising issue is complicated because every time sponsors pull from Tucker Carlson's show, guys like Mike Lindell from MyPillow are willing to prop Tucker up. So I think the 8 p.m. hour, which is Tucker Carlson's hour, Fox could be making more money at 8 p.m. if there was a more palatable host who was more sponsor friendly. But they've made a choice that they are not going to be intimidated by these left-wing ad boycotts. This is very much Lachlan Murdoch speaking here. He's not going to let these activists win. He's going to stand by his talent, even if that means having to sell ads to MyPillow that are less lucrative than ads to General Motors or GE. With Bill O'Reilly, I think there were an accumulation of things, including, as you mentioned, this advertiser pressure. Also, Rupert's business interests in the United Kingdom. He was worried about his deal for Sky at the time. And as a Fox veteran said to me, Rupert just wanted to rid Fox of the stench in the wake of Roger Ailes' exit and then O'Reilly. And of course, let's give credit to the Times, to Michael Schmidt and Emily Steele for exposing these secret settlements that O'Reilly had made. And I think also what happened in that time with O'Reilly was Fox knew that Emily and Michael knew more than they had even reported. There were even more details yet to come out. And so there was this accumulation of factors. But I think we all should keep an eye on this advertiser storyline when it comes to Tucker, because it is something that continues to challenge Fox News.
So Tucker Carlson, like Lou Dobbs, another opinion host on Fox News, used to work at your employer, CNN. And what do you make of the evolution of someone like Tucker Carlson? I mean, he was obviously always conservative, but it feels like there has been nonetheless a kind of substantive shift.
There has been. And I write in Hoax about my relationship with Tucker and the time when he donated money to my blog when I was in college. We had a friendly relationship for many years. And now he's on the air calling me nasty names that I don't want to repeat on this podcast. So what's changed? Well, he's become radicalized in some ways. He's become much more pessimistic about America and about Americans, which is in line with what's happened to the GOP. Look at the Republican convention and how dark the themes were. Look at the president's ugly rhetoric. I think he's a reflection of what's been happening more broadly to the party and to the network. Even though the party is in power, they act like they're not in power. And that's a lot of Tucker's shtick as well.
You work at CNN, as we said, mostly covering the media. How do you view Fox News from a professional standpoint? Do you see them as a competitor? And I'm curious then, what was it like? What were the challenges of writing a book essentially about this competitive news organization?
I actually think it was an advantage to be on the inside of a television network and then working on this book, as my other job. I even went out and bought a different computer. So I made sure I wanted to separate my lives and have my CNN life and my book life. But it was helpful to have a CNN life because sources were more willing to confide in me because they felt like I understood the business. I understood the pressures. I understood the ratings race. And so I was able to speak their language and get people to be more candid in conversations. So that it was actually an advantage when I thought it was going to be a challenge. And you ask how I view Fox. Look, I view Fox's ratings every day when the ratings reports come in at CNN. In some ways, they are a rival to CNN and MSNBC, but in many other ways, Fox is not. Fox is something different. It's almost an identity for people, almost a way of life. It's this vitriolic community. It's this beleaguered news operation. It's this thriving website. But more than anything else, what Fox is a propaganda machine. And I say that gently, I hope, because there are real journalists there trying to make a difference, trying to report the news, trying not to be a part of the propaganda problem. But viewers are glued to the Fox and Friends programs, The Five, Hannity. These are the much more propagandistic programs. And I think we can look at the Trump years and say the propaganda has worked with the Fox-Trump base in a way that there's just no equivalent in the Obama years, or frankly, for that matter, in the Bush years or the Clinton years, et cetera.
We're recording this on Thursday, September 3rd, and it was just announced the lineup for the debates that Chris Wallace of Fox News would be moderating the first debate. Does that cause you trepidation? Are you concerned looking ahead to the election about the role that Fox News might play?
I think there are some fair questions to ask about whether Wallace will be using Fox producers and Fox colleagues to formulate questions, and how foxy will the first debate be. But, Chris Wallace received rave reviews in 2016 when he moderated a debate. Chris Wallace, in many ways, is the exception to the Fox rule. He's able to be off on his own with his Sunday program, not influenced by the conspiracy type of programming that influences Fox the rest of the week. I think if anyone at Fox were going to get this debate pick, it was going to be Chris Wallace. It makes a lot of sense. He's kind of one of the deans of Washington journalism now. But I'll tell you this, Pamela, I feel like 5 years ago versus today, there's a lot more criticism of people like Chris Wallace and Bret Baier within the journalism community, within the television news world, this tight-knit, sometimes incestuous world where people hug each other in the front and stab each other in the back, right? There's a lot more resentment and even disgust with the fact that there are these news anchors at Fox who, in the eyes of their friends, are complicit. I know that's a tough word, but it's true. There's a sense of complicity that if you're working at the same channel as these propagandists, then you are part of the problem. And like I said, if anybody is able to be the exception to that rule, it is Chris Wallace, but it is still very much a topic of conversation in the Trump years. What
do you think? I mean, if you were offered, for example, a top anchor position on the news side of Fox News, would you accept that job?
It's such a funny hypothetical since it's so beyond unlikely. I don't think it would be possible to carve out a space for independent journalism at Fox right now. So the answer would be no. And again, I know they're not calling me. And by the way, the executives over there are going to laugh at me
I'm
talking
just trying
about
to
this.
Keep it light here.
I know they're going to pick on me for this, but that's okay. It's a very interesting hypothetical because here's how I would get to the answer yes. Okay, I would get to the answer yes by saying, if you can carve out your own staff and your own hour and be insulated from the pressures of the network, and not have to worry about viewers screaming at you for fact-checking Trump, and not have to worry about the ratings declining because you called out Trump's serial lying and hypocrisy, then yes, right? Then yes, you would take that job because you'd be able to speak truth to an audience that needs to hear it. That's what Shep Smith was trying to do. But Shep couldn't take it anymore, and Shep left.
And is that the Fox News that you discovered reporting this book, or does that Fox News not exist?
I don't think there's a way to fully insulate from the pressures. I spoke to too many news anchors and producers and correspondents there who feel like they are getting squeezed and suffocated by the opinion stuff, by the talk shows. And this is part of a broader problem in our country, this breakup into alternative realities. We talk about it often, the sense that there are two separate information universes, one of them much more tethered to reality and the truth. And Fox is a big part of that problem. But, I think the reason why so many sources talked to me is because they hope it can be better. They hope it can be different. They hope it can change. It doesn't have to be this way, right? Laura Ingraham doesn't have to be out there promoting hydroxychloroquine, despite all the scientific evidence to the contrary. There could be leadership. There could be accountability there. There could be change. Maybe someday.
Well, lots of people talk to you for this book. There are lots of juicy stories in it. The title, again, is Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth by Brian Stelter. Brian, thanks so much again for being here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Reed Hastings joins us now from Northern California. He is the co-founder and CEO of Netflix and also the co-author with Erin Meyer of a new book called No Rules Rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention. Reed, thanks so much for being here.
A great treat, Pamela.
So it's very interesting to talk to someone from Netflix about a book, an old-fashioned, I have it here in print, non-screen book. Tell me about the genesis of this and why you wanted to write a book to begin with.
You know, I've read so many interesting business books over the years. We wanted to contribute back and have other organizations be able to learn from what we're doing. And I would say many of the books I've read, I would call them CEO pontification books. And I always wonder when reading them, what's it really like inside? And that's why we recruited Erin Meyer to be my co-author, who's a business school professor. And she interviewed over 100 people in Netflix. And the book is me saying the theory and her saying the reality. And that tension, which sometimes is not pretty, is kind of what makes the book interesting.
What was the writing process like between the two of you? I mean, you have a kind of alternating narrative in the book itself, but how did you actually work together? Did you have like a big Google Doc? Did you text to one another? How did that work?
The most productive times were Erin and I brainstorming about structure and then her interviewing me and spending really hours on tape going through why we did this and why we did that and what was connected to this and what was important and what was working well and not well. So we tried to be very candid. Of course, nothing is perfect, including Netflix culture, but we really owe such a debt to all the organizations that went before us. And we wanted to contribute something around creative workforce. You know, for 300 years, the factory has been the dominant paradigm. Sort of do your job, high replication, don't think too much. And that's infused the whole culture. But creative work, you really want to stimulate people. We say you want to inspire people rather than supervise them. And our book is all the framework around that, which is good for companies that are in the creative space.
Well, I want to talk about the culture and some of the specifics. One of the key aspects of the culture is honesty always. And so I'm curious, both in terms of what you read from the transcripts that Erin must have had of your own employees, and then in her relationship with you, how upfront could she be about like, oh, this part isn't working, or sharing with you feedback from your own employees that may have been negative?
She was very direct about that, and I encouraged her to include it in the book. So there's a number of stories like that where the culture didn't work for the employee. Some of the time that's because we didn't execute it well. And some of the time it's just not a fit for what they want. And every culture is pretty unique. And what's important is just to be clear about who you're trying to be. And then, you know, the people who want that will join you.
So Netflix, of course, is not your first company. It's not the first company you started. In your previous experience at other companies, and perhaps in early days at Netflix, did you find that there were things you wanted to do differently with this company in terms of that culture, that corporate culture? Did it evolve over time, or did you go in knowing this is the way it's going to be?
Well, in my first company in the 1990s, I was an inexperienced and clumsy CEO, not very honest, avoided confrontation. And of course, that eventually tripped us up and we ended up selling to our largest competitor. So with Netflix, I really wanted to focus on a better way to be more flexible and not focus on efficiency as much. And so really, most companies focus a lot on error prevention, process, efficiency, and we try to do very little of that and really focus on stimulating creativity.
One of the key tenets of your culture falls under, or several of them fall under this rubric of freedom and responsibility, which sounds almost like a political platform. Can you explain what you mean by that? And is there an ideology behind it?
Well, if it was a political platform, you just see freedom. That is, in politics, they just talk about the good stuff. And what we're trying to do is really get at the tension that we want people to have great freedom, but also to take on great responsibility. And so if you build a culture around freedom and responsibility, employees seize the initiative to do what they think is right in many junctions, and that gives you a lot of flexibility.
I want to talk about another one of the surprising aspects of your culture. For anyone who's in a managerial position, it seems so counterintuitive, but you really have no rules around vacation, around expenses. Explain.
Well, those are the easy things. I mean, we also don't have rules around clothing, and yet people don't come to work naked.
That's your one rule, isn't it? That you can't come to work naked?
No, there's no rules at all. And we rely on good judgment in terms of vacation, in terms of expenses, in terms of clothing. And the thing that should probably really shock you is we say the goal is not to please the boss, because in most organizations, the way to success is to please your boss. And ours is to do what's right for the organization. And of course, inform your boss and don't hide anything. But you shouldn't sit around thinking about how do I please my boss. Instead, it's sitting around thinking around how do we please the members? How do we grow?
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you to kind of give an example, tell a story around that rule in particular, given Netflix is all about storytelling. Like, how does that actually work in practice?
Early on, Ted Sarandos, who's now co-CEO with me, and I, this is 15 years ago, we're thinking about the number of DVDs to get when we were in the DVD business for a big new title. And I said, well, I don't think it's going to be very big. And he reduced the order, and it turned out to be a very big title. And we didn't have enough of the copies, and we weren't serving our customers well. And I said, Ted, why didn't you get enough of this title? And he said, well, you said it wasn't going to be big. And I said, Ted, you are not allowed to let me drive, us off the cliff. You have to figure out what the customers really care about and not defer to my judgment. He's the expert. And so that's a good case that he tells of why it's important not to be pleasing the boss, but to think from a first principles standpoint, what's good for the business. In this case, how many DVDs to buy.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about books as a vehicle for storytelling, because obviously you've set out to write a book. It's a very specific form. What do you think a book can do in terms of storytelling and conveying information that, say, a Netflix TV series might not do as well?
Well, you never know. I mean, TV series and movies are very broad. And, people always say there's some books that are very hard to adapt to series and movies, but that may just be a lack of creativity.
It's a constant conversation among writers, the relationship between screen entertainment and book entertainment, both as vehicles for storytelling and information. I mean, one of the things that you hear novelists say now is that they aim to make their books as riveting as a Netflix series. How do you see the relationship between books and screen entertainment?
Well, I think all forms of entertainment, including video games and YouTube and books and television, competes for people's attention. And as they do that, they have to get better and better. But any one form is not going to achieve success by imitating another. So we don't sit around and say, let's make our movies to be more like Fortnite, the video game. We acknowledge that Fortnite's incredibly compelling for a lot of people. But then we don't try to become it. We try to make our art form be as great as it can be. And television has seen huge improvement since the 1970s, so over the last 50 years. It's tremendously more relevant and direct and open and controversial than, again, broadcast television used to be 50 years ago. Movies have had probably less innovation. That's probably an art form that, you'll see a lot of innovation now that we can do, movies direct to the home.
What are some of the innovations that you think that movies can have being direct to home? I mean, the example that comes to mind first with regard to Netflix is, of course, Cuarón's Roma, which had a much longer running time. Is that one of the sort of advantages that you see that a service like Netflix can offer for feature-length films?
Rome is a great example, both in its length that might not fit into a theatrical turnover situation, and also being a black and white film in Spanish and Oaxacan. So the beauty of being online is like you can turn subtitles on and off, you can turn dubbing on and off. There's a lot of things that then open up a lot of global audience to U.S. content or to international content for U.S. audiences. So language flexibility would be an example. Length would certainly be one where you can have your own intermissions where you hit pause, and get another glass of wine. So a lot of flexibility there that, storytellers are learning to exploit.
You mentioned the word competition when you were talking about Netflix versus a video game like Fortnite. And you've said in previous interviews that you see Netflix competition not just as other channels and viewing services, but as anything that people might spend time on for relaxation or stimulation. So I'm curious, do you see your book as competition for Netflix? Like, would you prefer people read your book or watch Netflix?
I prefer people read the book. That's much more direct. You got me on that one. It's a good setup. There's a book to read. And look, there's so many great books. So I just read Overstory, Richard Powers' book. And I have no idea how that, which is the beauty of the writing and the language, would be translatable, but again, into a series or film. But again, that might just be my own creative limitations. Maybe there is a way, and maybe that will someday be adapted.
I mean, now that Netflix is a creator of content and not just a distributor, are those questions that you yourself in your role become interested in and want to participate in? That idea of how can this be adapted into something that might be a series or film, something like the Overstory?
I should know it enough to appreciate how hard it is and to be able to give attention to those areas, but not fool myself that I'm the expert in those things. And so I want to have general awareness of what's going on in many areas of the company so that I can be a good cheerleader. But that's really the role for me, not to be the one who makes those decisions.
I'm going to stick with your example of Richard Powers' The Overstory, because one of the things that people loved about that book, it's of course a book that is an environmental parable in many ways, and the trees are kind of characters in that story and speak to one another. You've said that Netflix programming, that you see it as connecting people and building empathy. That's actually what I like to say about books. And I'm curious if you see a difference in the way they do that, because The Overstory, I think, is a great example of a book that builds a sense of connection and empathy, not just between human beings, but between the trees and human beings and sort of between us and the natural world.
Well, I think you're right that story generally is what connects us. So prior to the book, and we just had verbal storytelling, around a fire, then it was all oral. And then books was a tremendous expansion in storytelling for the last 500 years. And that's still an important force. But now TV and movies also add that kind of storytelling. But it all comes back to the human proclivity to want stories. And you see this in small children who just love to be told stories, whether that's oral, reading, or eventually movies and series.
I'm curious about measurement of success at Netflix and what success means for a show. Because with books, it's very tangible. I mean, you have critical success, of course, and you have commercial success. And with commercial success, it's the bestseller list. And it's in general, the sale of the book, a one-time transaction. How does that work for television when they're streaming TV shows, they're essentially on all the time?
It's very similar. I mean, a book's for sale all the time, and we make commitments to talent up front, as the book industry does to established authors. And then ultimately the publishers expertise is making sure that, the book comes together well and that it's heavily promoted, and they have to, guess right in terms of whose book will be popular. And then there's always amazing surprises in the book world as there is in the television world. So it's a pretty similar system.
What's the most surprising success that Netflix has had for you? What's sort of taken you aback?
Well, the surprising thing to me is how much I love the international work, the Turkish stories, the Japanese stories, the Brazilian stories that I just didn't grow up with. And now we've got them on Netflix, and we've got, production companies in most major countries, and how interesting, the broader world is. So we're not just Hollywood to the world. We're really sharing content from every culture.
I want to go back to where we started. You opened up with books, other books by CEOs, other business books, sort of what they did and what you wanted to do differently. Is there any kind of model, though, that you had in mind with regard to a business book that you said, you know what, like if I can do it as well as this person did?
Well, Phil Knight's Shoe Dog is a pretty compelling example because he shows how hard, all the things are, not directly about culture. But I would say Jim Collins' books, Beyond Entrepreneurship, Good to Great, Built to Last, those have been the most impactful books for me.
And then in terms of non-business books, you brought up the Richard Powers. So clearly you do read fiction. What kinds of fiction do you like to read? And how do you discover books? What's your path into a novel?
Oh, I'm so unsophisticated. I look and see what's popular. So I just read Why the Crawdads Sing, which I think is #1 now on the bestseller list.
What did you think?
I liked it, but I did not find the very ending credible. And so, it was enjoyable back of like living in the swamp. And I loved all that part. But the ending was too over the top for me. So I guess I'm just not that sophisticated because, in series and in films, I've got a big catalog and library. And in books, I'm a poser that drops in now and then and grabs something off of the bestseller list to read.
Is part of your brain always thinking like this could be a great series or this would never translate like while you're reading? Are you able to kind of close off that part of your brain, or is that always kind of there in the background?
It's always there in the background. I have not been able to really turn it off, but it doesn't take away the enjoyment.
Okay, one last question. If you were to take one of the no rules from your book and sort of say, you know what, this is actually something that just should apply to life generally outside the business world, what would it be?
Try to do the right thing instead of following the rules.
That's definitely a no rule, I guess. Reed, thank you so much for being here.
What a pleasure, Pamela. Thank you.
Reed Hastings is the co-founder and CEO of Netflix. His new book, co-written with Erin Meyer, is called No Rules Rules: Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How about you?
I'm okay. We're in back to school mode here. It feels like the fall a little bit. How about you?
We're delayed in New York City till the 21st. So it should be back to school this week, but it's more like extended summer, endless summer. But there's been a ton of book news, which is, as we've talked about before, for this period of the year is kind of unusual. And again, it's pretty classically for this moment in history that we're in, Trump books that keep breaking, the Michael Cohen and now the Bob Woodward. So that has kept everyone in the publishing industry and the book beat very busy. It's also been a surprisingly strong period for book sales. Again, despite the pandemic and the shutdown, print sales especially seem to be strong. So the latest overall picture that we have of the way the year is shaping up is from the Association of American Publishers. And according to their most recent report, trade sales were up 5% in the first 7 months of this year compared to last year. And so we're seeing especially strong growth in hardcover, which is up 5%. And downloaded audio continues to be a huge category. And ebooks, which had been declining before the pandemic, are way up for obvious reasons. It's an easy, convenient way for people to get books when they can't get to the store, or as it's increasingly common, if the book is not available in print. So ebook revenues were up 25% in July, which is the month they're looking at, compared to July 2019.
And when you say if the books aren't available in print, you mean not that they're ebook only, but that perhaps they've run out of copies because of sort of printing shortages.
That's right. And that's happening more and more, especially with the kind of financial pressures that are on the printing companies and the fact that there's been so much consolidation and some have shut down. Many authors have had their books delayed because of this, but some have said we've gone ahead with the digital release, so it's out in ebook now and it'll be out in print later, which is kind of interesting. There was a period in the past where publishers would sometimes delay the ebook because they thought, oh, this is a cheaper format. We want people to first buy it in print and get it later. So this is sort of an interesting reverse of that. The other thing, though, that keeps coming up, which I find kind of fascinating, is even though books are selling well and publishers seem to be doing okay, bookstores are still really struggling. So the latest figures that we saw from the Census Bureau, which tracks this, showed that bookstore sales fell 35% in June compared to a year ago. And June was a month when book sales were really strong. So the question is, where are those sales going? Of course, Amazon is taking up a large number of those book sales, but also big box stores like Target and Walmart have really shown that they can move books in a pandemic because people are going there to shop for essentials and they're picking up other stuff, or they're placing an online order and they're throwing some books in there. So that's kind of a worrying trend to see bookstores getting squeezed even more during the pandemic.
What about bookshop.org? How's that doing?
Bookshop.org really took off in the spring as an alternative to Amazon. This is a place where you can buy books from independent stores. You can sometimes specify which store you want the sale to come from, or you can simply buy them from Bookshop, and Bookshop itself raises money for independents, both those that choose to participate and sell books through the platform and stores that maybe aren't selling books through the platform, but just want a little bit, a cut of what they're raising. So the latest figure on their website is that they have raised more than $6.5 million for local bookstores, which is quite impressive. And that gets divided up, I think, a few times a year and sent out. So that has been, I think, one encouraging development in the pandemic. It really, I think, demonstrates that people who love bookstores, but also for whatever reason can only shop online right now, are finding alternatives.
All right. Sounds like we have grounds for cautious optimism. Alexandra, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues John Williams and MJ Franklin. Hey, guys.
Hey, Padma.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start with you, John. What did you read this week?
Yeah, I've been bouncing around some different stuff. I'm still reading The Executioner's Song, which I've talked about on here before, and that's really great. But it's sort of my bedtime reading, so I'm reading like 40 pages before bed every night, and it's a 900-page book. So
it's so nice to curl up with a book about murder at bedtime.
A book that you literally like almost can't lift up in bed because it's so heavy. But yeah, it's a strange decision on my part on multiple levels. But another book that I kind of bounced around in and that I'm going to talk about is a novel called A Legacy by Sybil Bedford. This is part of the NYRB Classics series with a terrific introduction by a friend of the book review, Brenda Wineapple. Bedford, she lived a very long life. She was born in 1911. She died in 2006. And so her life was very much entwined with sort of the history of Europe in the 20th century. She was born in Germany. Her father was German. Her mother was British born and partly Jewish. And she was raised sort of all over Europe. She became friends with Aldous Huxley and other famous thinkers. And actually, there's a biography of her coming in February, which should be interesting. A Legacy, I'm actually going to talk about this book in a broader way because we sometimes talk about the way we read on this show and not just the books. Like Pamela and I have recently admitted to a couple of memory lapses on our part in terms of books we've read and things like that.
I don't remember that at all.
I think Pedro burned the tapes. But it's a great book, but it's set during the run-up to World War I, and it's about two families and their relationships with each other. They're one member of each family, there's a marriage that sort of unites them. And the families are quite different from each other. One is wealthier, and it's full of great characters, great dialogue, and it also changes directions a lot, which is part of what I'm going to talk about. There's a sort of, you get to the end of one section and the book really changes perspective. It leaps in time. And so because I didn't read this the way that it might have been read best, which is, let's say, over the course of a 3-day weekend where you're just immersed in this book, I kept picking it back up. And I have to say that in addition to thinking it's brilliant, it also, my head almost exploded because I just couldn't keep track of, these are very large families. There's not a tree at the front of the book, which I normally don't like, but I was dying for by the end of this one. So the characters began to swim a little bit for me, especially in the second half. But she's fascinating. This is a great book. There are a couple more in the NYRB series by her. And I think she's developing something of a cult audience. And I'm sure that the big biography, which is coming from a major publisher early 2021, will do nothing to hurt that.
Okay, wait, hold it right there. What do you mean you don't like a tree at the front of the book?
Well, I shouldn't say I don't like it, but I guess because I'm not the most focused over a long period of time reader, when I see a big family tree at the start of a book, it almost makes me think the book is not for me. So it's normally a bit intimidating. And then it kind of puts me off on the wrong foot because I start to feel like not worthy of the book as soon as I start reading it.
Okay, wait, have you read War and Peace?
I have not read War and Peace.
Okay, read it with a tree. Just take it from me. I mean, you read that thing without a tree. The first time I tried and I gave up because between all the patronymics, you need the tree.
Oh, yes. Well, the tree is sometimes necessary for sure.
How do you feel about trees, MJ?
I love a good tree. I feel like I love books and stories about like these like intertwining family dramas. And so when I see a tree, for me, it's the opposite, John. It's like a key to me, like this book is for me.
MJ, even though this book doesn't have literally a tree, I do think it's for you.
John, I mean, a tree is very friendly to those soft on memory. I mean, a tree,
Exactly.
A timeline, like these are helpful aids.
No, you're right. After reading this book without a tree, I realized that though they intimidate me, I do need them.
Okay.
For sure.
You've gotten to the point in your life where
I should appreciate them rather than feel like they're an enemy.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is that I feel like you're like the New York Review of Books, sort of, friend of the library. And that
Yeah, well, right. I know. Well, it is a great series, but also I have found myself for some reason in quarantine, I've been reading even more than usual. And also insider trade secret, I'm actually reading a few things for work right now that I can't talk about, including a couple that I'm greatly enjoying, but that I'll have to talk about at a later date. MJ, what have you been reading this week?
So I have been reading The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. I have to admit there is no tree, but that is A-okay. So I picked this up for a few reasons. One is that I just feel like in 2020 in general, I've been reading so much nonfiction, both because there's so much good nonfiction being published right now, I feel like. But then also just like I get in these moods where I kind of get stuck in a genre and like memoir and nonfiction's it. But every so often, I feel like I need to shrug the world away and sink into a good novel. And a friend recommended The Heart's Invisible Furies to me. And so I checked it out, and it has been exactly what I've been looking for. I was kind of sold from the first line, which I'm going to read. So the first line goes, "Long before we discovered that he had fathered 2 children by 2 different women, one in Drimoleague and one in Clonakilty, Father James Monroe stood in the altar of the Church of Our Lady, Star of the Sea, in the parish of Goleen, West Cork, and denounced my mother as a whore." Like, I don't know how you can put this book down after reading that first line. And the book traces the life of one man in Ireland every 7 years over the course of his life, starting from when his mom is kicked out of the small town in West Cork and moves to Dublin and gives birth to him. And it's just been so fun. It's just like this like pitch perfect tone of like drama and scandal, and it's like cheeky, and it has been the exact escape I'm looking for.
It sounds a bit like a John Irving novel or something, like one of those really old-fashioned, like lots of incident.
Exactly. And it's funny because I, as a reader, don't gravitate towards like just a lot of plot. As I mentioned before, I love those intertwining family dramas, which is why I love A Good Tree. And so, but this seems like it has a lot of plot in such a fantastic, engrossing way.
Have you read other books by him?
I actually haven't. This is my first, and I'm definitely going to check out more. I know he has a new book that just came out earlier this year.
Oh, right. I was sort of assuming this was that one, but right.
Oh, no,
That's a different title.
This came out a few years ago, I think in 2017, 2018, but don't quote me on that.
Okay. Pamela, are you reading something new or old?
I read two books, one of which is pretty new and the other is older. The books are The Soul of an Octopus, A Surprising Exploration into the World of Consciousness by Cy Montgomery, and The Book of Eels, Our Enduring Fascination with the Most Mysterious Creature in the Natural World by Patrick Svensson. Okay, so yes, obviously, these are linked in my reading experience. I read them back to back, and I usually don't do that. I don't usually go from one thing into the next obvious thing. I like to swerve in my reading. And it's like once I'm done with a kind of book, I really want something different, like a total palate cleanser. But my impetus to read the Cy Montgomery, which I picked up first of these two, was similar to that of MJ. And then I just wanted to escape. And I was like, I had that, Beatles song running through my head the whole time I was reading both books. But I was like, I really do want to be deep down in the ocean, far away from everything and everyone else. And I read the Montgomery because my husband read it first. And after that, he made it pretty clear. I mean, I questioned him that he was no longer going to eat octopus, which is a disappointment to me because I like, a nice sort of shared octopus appetizer. And I was like, okay, well, I guess those days are done. But I'd long wanted to read this book. So I decided to read it then. Let me say that I am still going to eat octopus. I just want to get that out of the way, which is unusual because for me, the more I know about a food, the less I want to eat it. And I stopped eating red meat when I was 14 after going into the basement of the Turkish restaurant where I worked at the time, and I just saw too much. Part of the reason I think I'll still eat octopus is not only because I really do think it's yummy, but also I had a weird experience reading this book, which is that this is a book about octopuses. It's not octopi. It's one thing I learned. It's full of fun facts and their intelligence. And the fact that this is one of the, if you go back in evolution and look at the way in which the branches sort of, veered off from one another, we veered off from the octopus pretty much from the very get-go. And so our lines share very few links, and yet the octopus is a highly evolved creature and highly intelligent. So it's a very smart animal that is almost as different from us as any other creature you can imagine. And a lot of that difference is in the brain and in its consciousness. So I found all of that very interesting. And yet part of me, maybe just the cynical, skeptical me of 2020, couldn't help constantly asking myself, but do we really know that? There are all these instances in which, people working in aquariums describe octopus as doing extraordinary things. They seem to be playing, they seem to be doing hide and seek. They seem to have really intimate relationships with some people. They seem to hate other people, and douse them with water every time, that person comes near. And yet part of me is just wondering, is it all anthropomorphizing? Are we just reading this into the octopus? And meanwhile, the octopus maybe is just wee, just having, it may be all in and we don't know. And so I just wasn't 100% persuaded, I hate to say.
Well, I do a lot of reading about human consciousness, and I feel like there's a pretty well-established consensus that we don't really understand our own consciousness, so it's hard to make the leap to think we understand an octopus all that well.
Yeah. There's this book that came out a few years ago by the animal writer Franz de Waal, animal writer, no pun intended, called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And I guess I kind of feel like the answer is no, And so that's where I landed with the octopus. But there were some things I really enjoyed in the book. And one thing I really liked is that she writes about learning to scuba dive. And she just thought, being an animal person, being a nature person, she was just going to jump right into this and be this sort of champion scuba diver. And it scared the hell out of her. And having scuba dove, I don't know what the past tense is, having scuba dived myself, dove in, I haven't read about scuba diving and the terrors of it and had such a visceral reaction. She writes exactly the way it felt to me, which is to say, deeply, deeply unsettling. Like scuba diving is another thing that the more you know, the less you want to be a part of it. It's, it's not like being fully informed makes it any less frightening.
More frightening.
Right. It's scarier. It's not like, flying in an airplane, for example. One of the ways that people calm you down from when you're scared of flying is to kind of give you all the information. And you're like, oh, okay, it's fine to be up here in this metal box, 30,000 feet in the air because of this, that, and the other physics thing. You learn more about scuba diving. And the more you know, just the more you're like, this is not meant to be.
Why am I doing this?
Yeah. I am not going to eat eels, though. I'm not going to eat eels. So I just quickly on the Patrick Svensson, since I went from one to the other, there's really no comparison between these two critters. And it's kind of easy to believe that the eel has nothing intellectually on the octopus, no matter how smart or dumb an octopus actually is. I like animals that are lines, that are like essentially like this animal's just a line, It kind of makes it less somehow intimidating to be like, essentially you're two-dimensional. Svensson came on the podcast, so listeners know, I think, a little bit about the book from that earlier episode. The most fascinating thing to me was the way that they migrate, from the Sargasso Sea, which in my mind, and probably in all book people's mind, you can't say Sargasso Sea and not think of the wide Sargasso Sea. So I'm just going to say from the wide Sargasso Sea, and they go all over Europe and America, and then they come back to that sea, and like all migrations, I don't get it. So that was really interesting to me. But after reading both books, I sort of thought, I've had enough of books about people and their relationships to sea creatures to last me like a couple of years. It'll be a couple of years before I read about the starfish.
Pamela, I have a very selfish and important question, which is, as someone who is utterly terrified of octopuses, will reading the octopus book make me feel better, worse, curious? Like, how, for someone who has a fear of octopuses, how should we approach this book?
Okay. I'm going to tell you an anecdote, a personal anecdote again, and then I will shut up about my scuba diving. But I have seen both an octopus scuba diving and an eel. It was a moray eel. And the octopus drew me in. I wish I had spent much more time with that octopus. That part, I am with Cy Montgomery. You just want to be like, come on in and hug me with all those 8 arms. Like I don't think they're scary. The eel, the moray eel in particular, which is not the eel that's written about in Svensson's book, the moray eel is like a monster from hell as far as I'm concerned. When you are underwater, like like down 60 feet below, and you see a moray eel like opening and closing its huge jaw silently at you, just like, wow, like it looks, it's like, the first Alien where like the jaw comes out, sort of very silently from a corner.
No, I'm never going scuba diving. I mean, I wasn't going to anyway, but now I'm definitely not.
Yeah, I feel like my fear of octopuses has not been assuaged, but now I have a new fear of eels.
Okay. My work here is done, MJ. All right, let's run down the titles and authors again. John?
I read A Legacy by Sybil Bedford.
I read The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne.
And I read The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery and The Book of Eels by Patrick Svensson. All right, MJ, John, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.